This is the Storyworks Roundtable, where we have conversations about craft. Because becoming a successful author begins with writing a great story. Hello and welcome to this week's Storyworks Roundtable. Today, Robert, Kathryn, and I are discussing time. So, besides never having enough of it, how does it function in fiction? When do you expand it? When do you shrink it? Let's start there. Problems with time, guys. When you're writing, when do you start thinking about time?
Often with the most simple things, such as, so how long does it take to drive from California to New York then? And since I'm in Australia, I have to kind of Google that sort of stuff, because it doesn't automatically come to mind. Or like my mother will ask me, who lives in the UK, I saw that, you've got really bad problems with coronavirus again. Yeah, Mum, that's 1,200 miles away. So, I think they're the obvious ones, aren't they? That when you'll pick up when you're in revision, you go, oh, I just made it just 2 hours for them to get right across the country. No, that can't be done. So I think it comes to me first with physical distancing and the basic stuff. But I'm sure for a lot of people that's where it stops.
Yes.
So realistically, a story is something that involves time. It has a beginning, a middle, and an end. And regardless of how you chop that up, whether you do a Tarantino mix-up or you just keep it sequential, you've still got to make some considerations. And I can remember when I was writing my middle grade trilogy, I suddenly realised that about 8 weeks had passed, and this what started out as a 12-year-old girl has probably aged to 14 in 6 weeks. And just about gone through 3 portals, saved the earth 3 times, and is still worried about school. So I think sometimes, obviously, you're suspending disbelief anyway. So we all know that in cozy mysteries, you're going to get 15 murders a year in a tiny village and no one bats an eyelid. But still, right. I think you have to keep half an eye on that sort of thing. So to me, they're the global issues of time. How does the plot function?
Yes.
And you've got those very specific things, such as flashbacks, or where the character is thinking back in time, and how do we use past tense to describe that without confusing the reader, etc. So I think it's a really complex issue.
It is. It is a very start. Yeah, that's a very complex issue. So let's start with the practical aspects of time, like how long does it take to travel this distance, or what is the chronological order of events in my story? And then let's move into some of the more nuanced aspects like flashbacks Robert mentioned, or, when do we speed up time? When do we condense time within the frame of our story, because we do have to control the experience of an event in a way that is unreal, that suspension of disbelief Robert mentioned. If you fire a gun in a movie, you can see that event essentially in real time, right? But in a story, there's so much more you need to do descriptively to create that experience. So, okay, practical first. Any specific issues with practical time that we should address?
Timeline errors.
Yes.
This stuff always gets me when I'm reading a book, and I'll be like, wait a second. Didn't they just say it was Monday and now it's the weekend? And when did this happen? And there's no logical jump in time, or if they have 2 protagonists that are supposed to be running parallel to each other, and it's Monday here and Wednesday there, or, like something like that. A lot of it just comes down to having to map out your time and your timeline so that you can be aware functionally of how your time is practically working, which I hate doing as a pain in the butt, but it is necessary, like Robert said, to catch those things. Like, oh, I just went from California to New York, and it was Monday the 2nd, and now it's Tuesday the 3rd, and it's been technically 13 hours, and how did that work? And, so, yeah.
Right. And that's really just about being careful, being a conscientious writer and doing doing the grunt work of building an actual timeline of events through your story and checking the plausibility and such. Mm-hmm.
Being careful about when and how you refer to your time.
Yes.
True.
Yeah, and that's assuming, you know, a story that doesn't have portals or, you know, time travel and such. And then when you change timelines, like having parallel stories, or when you're using flashbacks, or when you've got, you know, that's when you really need to be mindful of creating a structure that doesn't confuse the reader.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So how about flashbacks? You know, in the context of discussing controlling time. So you know you need a flashback. You need to show this backstory. The best way to do it is through flashback. Any issues or thoughts about flashbacks specifically?
Well, I think it has to drive the plot. It has to drive the story, or the character arc. It's pointless if the flashback is just going to fill in backstory. Mm-hmm. It's a lazy way to do that, in my opinion. As a reader, you just get bored, because often it will happen at a critical time in the story where the author has decided, in order for this next bit to make sense, you know, we now need 3 chapters about the protagonist's childhood. When there's something really exciting about to happen. So, you know, there's a classic mistake I think that we all snobbishly complain about. Mm-hmm. But, you know, it's real. You know, so the first question that I would always ask, because I'm not a fan of flashbacks, is why do you need it? Mm-hmm. And what does it add to the story's momentum? Because by definition, a flashback is going to slow the momentum down because we're going back in time.
Mm-hmm. Potentially. I mean, it's, you know, when you need to fill in backstory, you can do so with dialogue, narrative exposition, or a flashback. And a flashback is fleshing it out into a full scene, actually taking the reader back in time to have a lived experience with the characters, right? So we've just left the timeline of the story to go back and see that. And sometimes showing it as a lived experience is the best, most dramatic, tension-filled way to reveal that. Other times, you're much better off using something like dialogue, where you stay in the scene and everything is moving forward. And then, you know, the third option, narrative exposition, is the tidiest, because you can deliver that backstory in a few sentences or maybe a few paragraphs at most. So, you know, if well done, none of those should slow your pace or slow your tension, you know. And in the exposition, you pause the forward-moving action to expound upon the past, right? In dialogue, everything keeps moving forward. And in a flashback, it's like, boom, we're stepping out of time and, you know, doing a little wave of the magic wand to experience something in the past.
I guess also depends on the style and voice of your story too, because, you know, if you've started out with a few drips of flashbacks here and there, then, you know, if you have a bigger section of that at some point, it's not going to disappoint the reader if they've made it that far already, because they're already happy with the style. So I was just thinking, I've just finished rereading Werner Vinge, A Deepness in the Sky, which is a classic sci-fi, speculative, really, I suppose. You wouldn't put it into military or space opera. It's not, although it's a space action adventure, it'd be hard to classify it as a specific genre. So it's a wide-ranging story, and it involves an alien species. It involves a sun system where the sun turns off for 100 years at a time, and the species on the planet are spider-like. They have 10 legs, and they have to go into frozen hibernation while the sun is off. And the humans who have arrived are factionalized and almost at civil war. And one of the humans in one of the factions has an alias and is a mythical trader that everyone knows of, but no one knows this guy's that dude. He's got he's had surgery and he's got a different name, and he's working behind the scenes and he knows all this stuff to disrupt something. Anyway, it's probably too much information, but there's one part where you get quite a lot of backstory of this particular character, and it is key to driving his actions in the story, and even the momentous final decision he makes, which would go against the grain of values that he'd had for quite some time. Now, these are all long-lived characters as well, so we've solved by now the problem of sheer mortality. You can't go on forever, but you can do a good, couple of 100, 300 years through life extension methods. And so I was talking to my daughter, who's 17, about it, and she said, it sounds really interesting, because I was talking about the spider aliens and the planet that the sun that turns on and off. And she said, can I read it? I said, sure. So she started reading it, and I didn't know she'd started reading it. And then we were sitting somewhere in the lounge. She said, wait, Daddy, does this keep hopping around in time? Like, do you go back 150 years in the past? And not because of this particular character, but they were switching POV between the spidery aliens, and it was flashing back a little bit to when the sun was about to turn off, and so everything was about to go into this waning. And of course, the writer he likes to start everything without much explanation. So you're suddenly diving into this alien life. Where am I? Are the humans here and they don't know, or are they in orbit? Or so you really do have to figure it out, and you have to get used to that type of voice. But once you do, it's really enjoyable. So it's a story where time jumps around a lot, and there's lots of flashbacks, and these are things that I don't normally enjoy, yet I found it tremendously satisfying.
Well, that proves the rule that you can do anything you want so long as you do it well, right? If you succeed at it, you'll get away with it, but some things are harder to do than others, right? Yeah, and it also raises the issue of transitions. So, that example aside as the exception to the rule, when you do have a flashback or some other kind of jump in time, you need to create a sense of transition so that the reader doesn't jump out of the story and feel confused and have to do mental gymnastics instead of just being engaged through the story. And another critical component of writing a successful flashback is that you don't typically, exceptions to every rule, but you don't typically want to place a flashback in the middle of a hardcore action scene. So a great time for flashbacks is when your character is in a traveling scene. I'm in the car, or I'm sitting at my desk, or I'm stirring the pot on the stove, waiting for the kettle to boil, whatever. Those are great moments where the action is in a natural kind of ebbing moment, and we've got a little bit of breathing room. And so the flashback can even feel like we're inside the character's head going into a memory without actually doing that, which typically feels very heavy-handed. Sarah remembered when she was 10 and her mother, right? So you just insert a couple of hads and go into the flashback writing to have the we'll go back to guns. It's so violent, but easy example to have someone, pull the trigger and then insert flashback and delay the reaction of was our hero shot or not, right? That's what we never want to do.
Well, and I know this is like super structural, but it is a separate scene. Please treat it like a separate scene and give us that break on the page. Like, I hate that when I feel like I'm head hopping with the flashback because I'm reorient. So I think you can do flashback in scene, right? But if you're doing like a separate whole scene flashback, like, you need to give us that demarcation where it's very clear visually, and then also through the language and through the past tense and through the change of, time location. Exactly what's going on. When it's done well, flashback can be so powerful. It just gets really angrifying, which is my own word. I know that.
It's a good word. We'll adopt it here.
And I'm just like, wait, what? Stop. No, I don't like that. Why did you do that? And now I'm somewhere else or somewhen else. And I had to take a second to figure it out. So I think it's different when, like Robert was talking about in the science fiction novel, when you're completely changing point of view too. And then it's more like a time jump than a flashback.
Right.
I think there's a little more flexibility with how much you have to give the reader, because then there's almost that mystery, like putting it together, like, oh, wait, no, the humans haven't shown up yet, or this hasn't happened yet, or, you know, and so it adds to the intrigue. But if you're just trying to throw a flashback in there, like, give your readers clear demarcation and clear identifiers.
I suppose a good question to ask is, how much work are you expecting your reader to have to do?
Right.
And so, as you say, Kathryn, the easiest thing is if you at least give a clean scene break, then you're starting with almost a fresh sheet of paper for the reader. And we all know that that's not a rule. That's just it's a great way. It's a good way to philosophically think about it. Okay, I'm having to make a shift because now what I'm inserting should have some structure. There's a point to it being there. But if I think about also books that have done it seamlessly, like A Man Called Ove, for example, where purely you're shifting tense, and all of a sudden you realise that you've just been taken back in time, and it's so skillfully done, and it's a translation.
Right.
It's so skillfully done that you sucked in. And there are, I suppose there are a million ways to skin a cat with this one. It's a matter of being careful.
Right. Well, in A Man Called Ove, those were separate chapters. The present chapters, which were, written in the present tense, and then the past chapters written in the past tense. So besides the tense shift, which, because you were so involved in the story, became invisible to you, you had actual chapter breaks, demarcating that.
Yes.
And a scene break...
So I even forgot about that. So,
yes.
That shows how fluid it felt.
Right. And scene breaks, visual scene breaks, the line break, may or may not be necessary. It depends on the transition. So it's all about how you are transitioning the reader into that moment. And, if it's
whether
a more
involved scene or...
Yeah, if it's like more of a jump cut type transition, then I would use the scene break. But if it's a fluid narrative transition, then the line of white space might actually be disruptive to the reader, because the flow of narrative is taking us smoothly into and then out of that flashback. So, give your readers effective transitions. That's what it comes down to. What about controlling time in terms of compression and expansion, speeding up and slowing down time?
Yeah, it relates to something I thought about when we were just starting out. You said, when do you consider time in your story? It's many authors will have a story that has a time element, in the sense that there's either a ticking clock or the plot depends on that. So I think that's when you've got to be cognizant of, are my mechanics correct in terms of, say, doing the travel from LA to New York or whatever. But also, how much time do I want to dedicate, say, in the climactic part, where it's all going to happen in the space of 30 minutes, whereas the rest of the book takes 6 weeks or 5 years, who knows? So I think that's also when we're looking at, well, if I'm going to have a ticking clock, then I need to make that more exciting, but I'm potentially going to spend more words on that. So it's a dichotomy, isn't it?
Right.
And like we've talked about with fight scenes before, or action scenes, you actually slow them down to make them feel faster.
Right. Right, yeah, and there is an old adage that the faster something happens in real life, the longer it takes to happen on the page. Because you need more description to bring it to life, because the action gets complex as it gets fast. And so also, if you're dealing with your climax, even if it's an internal character-driven climax, you want that moment to be all embracing, all encompassing for the reader. You want an immersive experience, right? And so that isn't something you want to pass by your reader in the blink of an eye.
Right.
Whatever that transition is, that shift that the character experiences, the realization, the awareness, the whatever, the end of that triggers the end of that character arc. It takes effort, takes ink on the page to create that experience for somebody else, for your reader.
Yeah, you don't want to get towards the end of your book and then have a jump cut to the the denouement.
Right.
Wait, what? It all happens? Oh, what happened? Oh, I was looking forward to that confrontation.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, no, that's that bit out. It's too hard to write.
Yes. Yeah, and okay, so we want to expand time in action scenes and in scenes of high dramatic tension, whether the climax or something else. When else might we want to expand time in our story to devote more ink to the moment that's passing for our character?
Intimacy, or moments of high emotion, high drama, I suppose. So not necessarily action adventure drama, but dramatic turns, and maybe whenever there's a significant plot turn, or a complication that is going to be even more, as you say, immersive for the reader, whether it's at the beginning or the end. Right,
and also mood. You might be describing the wind rustling the leaves on the tree, and that might take a second to observe visually. Or if it's really, if you're really setting the mood, it might take 3 or 5 seconds if this were film. But in description, in narrative, you're going to have to give words to the light, to the color, if there's any sound that the wind makes in those trees, and, paint the picture of the setting. Is it really a close focus on just the leaves, or are we looking at the whole tree? Are we looking at the larger landscape? Does our narrative lens shift so that perspective changes? So you could spend a page or two describing a setting element in order to make it an immersive experience that really creates a mood and sets a stage,
There we go.
We go.
We're jump cutting right now. So yeah, I agree. It's a deft thing, isn't it, to be able to do without verging into boredom, and that's why I think it's hard to edit your own work when it comes to time, because it is very much a reading experience, and to me it does help to either print it out and read it as a book, or plop it on a Kindle or a device, so that you can experience it as a reader. Because at the sentence level of revisioning, or even plot level of revisioning, sometimes those feeling elements of, oh wait, I just spent 3 pages panning in, don't necessarily occur to you if you're not in the reading flow, which I think is why having beta readers, good editors, advanced readers, all that kind of thing, can help clear up parts where the book seems to slow down or speed up too much. Which is one of the classic questions you can ask for feedback. Where did you feel like it didn't move along, or where did you get lost? And maybe that's a clue to where we skip too much time. Because I like because the opposite obviously is jump cuts, where you just leave out a whole chunk of plot or story.
Right.
And sometimes even critical elements. If it's a mystery or thriller, you might do it just to be a little bit disingenuous and sneaky with what you're holding back for the reader. As long as you don't do it repetitively or annoyingly, then that can be a great device, because then you get swept up in the momentum. Oh, hang on a minute, no, she never revealed the plan, so what are they going to do then? So, and now you're in the middle of the next bit. So I think sometimes we think we have to write everything down. I certainly fell into that trap when I was first telling stories, where you just think you have to explain everything to the reader, and you don't. You can backfill, as you said, Alida. You can even do, backstory within little drips of dialogue. I mean, people don't sit down and explain things to one another.
Right.
Okay, so let's drive over to your mother's place then. How about we go the back way this time? And people just don't do that. You just
yes.
10 minutes later we were at her door. That's enough.
So there's an example of speeding up time. Using the jump cut or the summary, the narrative summary, to speed up time.
And we've seen that done very dramatically because, for example, I'll Give You the Sun, I think, where you jump around years. So each chapter is date stamped, and I think there are 3 different timelines running in the book from memory. So it'll say, 2013 or 2009 or, so, and it's a little disconcerting, but it's so beautifully written, that you just, you actually look forward to, great, we're going back into this bit now, it's very interesting because you see the play out from one part to the, from the past to the future.
Okay.
And 2 different characters, and both written first person from memory as well. So very clever.
Nice.
Yeah, those time jumps, those can be kind of fun, either to do them linearly with like massive year gaps in between, or like whole sections that then you can ostensibly just say like the next 3 summers past or something like that, right? But then you can kind of use that, like you said, Robert, to hide stuff that happened that then is going to affect later that you didn't necessarily have to have in that moment, but could come up, down the line. And then also being able to then mix that around, like the classic example, Catch-22 comes to mind, just where they've mixed the timeline up so much that you just don't even know what is the present and what is the past, and that's the point, right? Is that you're not supposed to feel like there's an end coming. But it's like interesting to use that for intrigue and for building tension, like where what you're leaving out becomes just as interesting as what you've put in, for the reader.
Right. Have you guys seen the show How to Get Away with Murder?
No.
It's Shonda Rhimes.
I've typed into Google a lot.
Haven't we all? Isn't that something writers do like every day? Yeah, it's a Shonda Rhimes show with Viola Davis, but it really plays around with time, and it'll show you a piece of the climax, and then it'll say like 3 months previously. And then you get into another episode and it'll show you a new piece of the climax, and then it'll be 2 months previously or whatever. So as you go through the season, you start piecing together, you get new information about the climax. You're like, oh, who was shot? Oh, so-and-so was there when that was, oh, so-and-so has blood on them. Oh, this was, right. And so you keep getting clues, little elements to the climax as you're getting the events that built up to that climax revealed to you. So you're doing a little detective work as the viewer, piecing all of these things together so that by the end of the season, when the timeline is actually caught up to the climax, you've got the whole story.
Right.
Which
is a clever way to loop the reader into doing the same thing the characters are doing, or the viewer in this case, right? You're actively participating in the same sort of detective solving work that the characters are then doing. Yeah.
True mystery.
Yeah. And a great example of expanding time is Bullet in the Brain by Tobias Wolff. It's a very short story, and you can find a PDF online. So Bullet in the Brain, check that one out to see time expanded. Do you guys have other Yeah, Robert.
Yeah, I have one more example, which I didn't particularly enjoy yet. It's one of my favourite sci-fi series ever, which is Isaac Asimov's Foundation series, which, as anybody who's read them knows, spans millennia. And in one of the books, you actually, I think it's at the midpoint, you jump, I think it's 500 years. And it's very disconcerting because you spent an entire half of the book with characters that you've grown to love, and then all of a sudden they're gone, they're dead. And now we've new characters to get connected to. So the writer has to have great skill in building new empathy and relating it back to what had happened. And I mean, in Asimov's case, it's quite cleverly done, but it's disconcerting at first, and it does leave you with an emotional, gut punch, because you sort of they're dead, and you don't know how or why or what's happened, or so there's that way as well, where you can have these massive, and there's no particular flashback, it's just happened.
Right.
Yep.
I mean, you get that a lot in fantasy as well, I guess, where you get great empires rising and falling, and things can be done with framing, so you've got prologues, epilogues, and framing devices.
Right. And framing is a nice way to reveal something to the reader that piques their interest, so a high point of intrigue, and then you come back around to it in your timeline, or you show something from the past, that's outside the timeline of your story, but is, inherent to what happens, or integral to what happens in the main chronology. Yeah, those are other good ways to play with time. And
Princess Bride, for example, as well, where you've got a really long, drawn-out story that's told in snippets to a kid. So you sort of come back to the kid, and you realize not much time is passing for the grandfather and the kid, but you've got all this time passing in the fairy story. So that juxtaposition, I think, allows the wondrousness of being lost in a thought that seems to last for months, yet you may have just been daydreaming at your desk, or you have those weird waking dreams in the morning where time just seems to take on weird elements. So framing devices, I think, can help with that too.
Yes. Yeah. That reminds me of The Secret Life of Walter Mitty, where he starts daydreaming and then he's off on some grand adventure far away, but really it's only a few moments in his head. All right, final thoughts on controlling time. I guess not.
That must be the end.
That must be the end. Yes. Thank you for listening to the StoryWorks Roundtable. Find all our shows, show notes, and videos at storyworkspodcast.com.